Hello and welcome to Heartlight Vedic Astrology. Today I'm going to talk about upcoming planetary transits or Gochara from a Vedic astrology or Jyotish perspective for the month of July 2023. And the theme of the month seems to be Step Up and Lead. So let's take a look. Note first, the information presented here is for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical, financial, professional, or life advice of any kind. If you are in need, please contact an appropriate professional for support, and then you might take a minute or two to read the rest of this disclaimer. All right, so let's look at the dates when things are shifting in the sky in July. We don't have actually so many aspects or things that are shifting, but there's still some important stuff going on. So July 3rd, I think that's tomorrow, isn't it? Yeah, tomorrow. There's a full moon in Sagittarius or Danu in Sanskrit. It's going to be in the nakshatra Purva, and also Mercury enters Punarvasu nakshatra tomorrow. On July 6th, Venus enters Leo or Simha, Rashi constellation, and at the same time it enters Magha nakshatra. On July 8th, Mercury enters Cancer or Karka, Rashi constellation. July 9th, the next day, Mercury enters Pushya nakshatra. So it shifts pretty fast. July 10th, Rahu, there's going to be an exact aspect of Rahu on Mars. And then July 13th, Mercury leaves combustion or asta. On July 16th, Sun enters Cancer, Karka. So you can see there's some movement of some of the planets into Cancer. So again, if you're looking at your own chart, you want to find out where Cancer is in your chart and what house that represents. And that same day, Mercury enters Aslesha nakshatra. The next day, July 17th, there's going to be a new moon in Cancer, Karka. So again, more Cancer energy in Punarvasu. On July 20th, the Sun is going to create an exact aspect to Mars. On July 22nd, Venus goes retrograde. It's aspected by Rahu almost exactly, not quite, because it's just about to go exact and then it starts going backwards. So just quite misses it, but it's still within a degree before it turns around and goes backwards. Mars enters Purva Phalguni nakshatra at the same time. July 24th, Mercury enters Leo or Simha. Also, so you also see all these planets moving into Leo. So that's also an important Rashi constellation. So again, if you're looking at your own chart, if you know which house that represents, that's going to be important. So again, it enters Leo, Simha, and also Magha nakshatra at the same time. Then July 26th through 28th, there's going to be a planetary war or graha yuddha between Mercury and Venus. And during that time, there's going to be an exact aspect of Mercury by Rahu. So Rahu is going to be stirring the pot quite a bit. And then July 30th, Venus goes combust or asta. So that's what's going on, and let's dive into it. I don't think I mentioned on the slide when I was going through the dates of planet shifting around. That I do have, in addition to these monthly transit videos, I also do teaching videos on Jyotish, Vedic astrology. So whenever you see a double asterisk anywhere in my talk, that means that there's a teaching video available. And so if you're interested in that, you can go to the concepts playlist that I have, and I put all my teaching videos there. So if you're interested in learning more about, diving into more of these kind of concepts, you can go there. Before I dive in too much into actually all the upcoming events in July, there's been a lot going on in the news, and so one of the things that I started looking at was the Titanic sub implosion, that kind of exploratory sub that was looking at Titanic remains or hoping to, but unfortunately it imploded, and there was some loss of life. So I did come up with a chart for that. Here it is. This chart is based on June 22nd, 2023, 15:22 in the afternoon, Eastern Standard Time. And this is when I started seeing headlines of the news that the sub because they weren't sure what happened to the sub, that they found out that for sure it had imploded, unfortunately. But it is an interesting chart, and so let's take a look. So if we start at the first house here, right, that's usually the most important thing to do to kind of orient yourself for the rest of the chart. So the first house is right at the top here. Again, this is a North Indian style chart. This is also called the rising sign ascendant, and I have a whole video on that if you want to take a look at that. We also call it the lugna in Jyotish. So, this first house here, it's in Libra or Tula, and the ascendant nakshatra is Chitra. Chitras is symbolized by a gemstone. So, you can cut gemstone, and so you can see all these facets and that sort of thing. So, Chitra tends to symbolize things that are like structure oriented, architecture, and that sort of thing, like design, but in a very tangible, way. Libra happens to be ruled by Venus. Venus has gone to the 10th house of career and fame, actually. Also, before we talk about Venus, which is the ruling planet or Lagnatia of the chart, we can see still in the rising sign in the Lugna, we have Ketu, which is in Swati. Swati is represented by young grass wavering in the wind. And so Ketu is a planet that represents things like disconnect, it's an erratic planet, explosions, and again, this Swati energy, this kind of instability. So you can see already just between Chitra and Swati, we're talking about structure that's unusual and also probably not particularly stable. There is also this aspect, if you see the red arrow of Mars going from the 10th house to the Lugna, Mars is in Aslesha, which is represented by a snake. And so when you have Mars, which is another unstable, erratic planet, in Aslesha, which is kind of this snake energy, this kind of hiss, bite, run away type energy. And I think I mentioned in other videos, when I see planets in Aslesha, there are two things that usually occur. One is that, like snakes, the planets tend to be, um, the energies represented by the planets in Ashleisha tend to be very mesmerizing and attention grabbing. And actually, in this chart, we have three planets, Moon, Mars, and Venus. So 3 out of 9 planets from Ashleisha. So this was an attention grabbing event. The whole world was kind of riveted around this, at least in the States. I don't know about other places in the world, but here it was like, nonstop news. The other thing about Aslesha is that um, I do see in people's charts when there's strong placements in Aslesha that can indicate sudden, unexpected, strange kind of ways of passing away. And so again, we have 3 planets in this, yeah. So we have Mars, which aspects 4 houses away into the Lugna. So it brings this Aslesha energy or more erratic Aslesha energy into the Lugna. And again, the reason why that's important is that anything in the Lugna is going to influence the entire chart. That's why we always start with analyzing the Lugna first, because it sets the tone. It kind of grounds the um, chart analysis. Yeah. Also, we do have Jupiter, which is in Bharani nakshatra, also aspecting. That's the yellow arrow pointing upwards. Jupiter in Jupiter is represents human life, and Bharani is a nakshatra that represents things like cycles of life, like life and death, because it's represented by a womb. So, unfortunately, with K2 and Mars together, Mars aspect in K2, you get this explosive energy, and then Jupiter here, this can indicate loss of human life. The thing too to recognize, which we'll get into a little bit more later, is that Saturn, you can see I've circled that. It's in the 5th house. It's retrograde and it's Swa. It's in its own constellation, Rashi. Saturn is super, super strong, and it's aspecting directly onto Jupiter. So, although Jupiter is a sign of generally benefic energy, although not always, the super strong Saturn is going to suppress the optimistic effects of Jupiter as well as the grace that Jupiter can bring to a situation. And Saturn is in a nakshatra Shatabhisha, which is can represent things like things that are difficult to remedy, especially diseases and situations like that. So you have the super strong Saturn. Saturn is a malefic planet, so you're going to get the more negative aspects of Shatabhisha. So rather than potentially being a healing planet, again, this might indicate, loss of life. We do also have this Mars aspecting onto Saturn. When you have a Mars Saturn aspect or combination like that, you typically get things like workaholics, but also engineering and athleticism and that sort of thing. And Saturn is in the fifth house of counseling and intellect. So there's going to be a lot of energy here trying to figure out how to save the sub, because again, it's an unusual situation. Yeah. So let me go back to the 10th house a little bit here, follow my notes. I try to, even though my consciousness and intuition kind of goes all over the place, I try to make this a little bit more organized so it's easier to follow along with what I'm talking about. But anyway, in the 10th house, we have the moon, which represents things like the public and sentiment emotions. We have Mars, which represents action. We have Venus, which represents social grace and relationships and that sort of thing. Again, all three of these are in the nakshatra of Aslesha. Um, but all three too, when you get a combination like that, this is a passion combination. All three of these planets are considered passionate planets, and we get all three together, there's a lot of passion. And so again, this is sort of like that, passion of the public because the moon is there, and this is all happening in Cancer. Moon rules Cancer, so Mars and Venus are going to be under the heavy influence of a strong moon here, although the moon isn't too far away from the sun, so it's sort of a newish or at least a dark moon here. There's not a lot of power in the moon. But it's still Mars and Venus are going to be dominated by the moon. So again, emotion and um, sentiment and intuition even. And again, this is all in the 10th house of career and fame. So this is going to be, an event that's going to live down in history, something that's very emotional and strange and just bizarre, sudden, um, taking of life, unfortunately. So the fifth house I mentioned, Swa, Saturn, and Aquarius Kumbha. So again, Aquarius, we can talk about that a little bit. Aquarius is an air sign, so we're talking about ideas. Um, and so again, it's this idea of like engineering. Like I always think of Aquarius as sort of like NASA scientists, which is kind of what was going on here, except instead of in the sky, it was, deep in the water in the ocean. This Saturn in its own sign in Kendra, or excuse me, not a Kendra, it's a trikona, trinal house. Yes. Excuse me, that creates a Shasha yoga, which is a Raj yoga, sort of a majestic yoga of well, Shasha yoga. Well, it's a Pancha Mahapurush yoga, which is a Raj yoga, which indicates sort of usually fame, not always money, but position, status, fame, that sort of thing. Shasha yoga, because it's Saturn, you get in a way the best aspects of Saturn, but still it's Saturn, and Saturn can represent things like delays and obstacles and that sort of thing. So you get both of those. And again, you have this aspect by Mars, so that kind of reinforces that idea of engineering. Sorry, I'm going to be taking a lot of drinks today. Um, the air quality the last few days has not been great, and so I think it's affecting my voice. Again, this is due to the forest fire smoke that's coming down from Canada, but I'll do my best, so hang in there with me if you can. Um, so then if we look at the seventh house, this is a place of relationships and independent business. Again, we have Jupiter and Bharani, so life and death, humans, and Rahu, which is again this ambition, drive. But again, there's always this sort of hidden, bizarre element of Rahu, and it's an Ashwini, so there's this like strong drive to rescue because Ashwini is the Kumara twins who are the celestial healers and that sort of thing. So there's a strong drive, especially when you get Jupiter, which is expansion, and Rahu together. But again, unfortunately, this is all under the influence of this very strong Saturn, which is going to slow things down and create obstacles. And again, this is the Jupiter and Rahu combination with the Saturn aspect is happening in Aries, which is a fire sign. It's a movable sign. There's a lot of action here. Um, but again, I think the influence of this heavy Saturn on these two slows down the rescue operation, and then you've just got this massive combination of K2, Mars, and the Lugna. So that's going to be difficult to remedy. The eighth house, we have Mercury. Mercury is, so the eighth house represents things like deep psychology. Um, Mercury represents, analysis and, rational thought, that sort of thing. It's in Mrigashirsha nakshatra, which is the start of seeking and searching. So it's like research. So it's like trying to come up with some sort of, rational, logical answer to remedy the situation. The eighth house also represents that sort of things that are hidden and underground or, deep in the ocean in this case. So again, there's a searching for answers deep within the person and the physical world. And then we have in the ninth house, which represents authority, fathers, spirituality, that sort of thing, we have Sun. So if you saw my Karko Bhavanasha video, you'll recognize that this is a Karko Bhavanasha. Um, so it's basically a planet breaking the house, and the sun symbolizes authority, government, fathers, that sort of thing, and it's in the house representing the same. So even though you might think this is a good thing, it actually it's almost like too much energy here, and so it brings difficulty. Um, and so it brings difficulty to the sun, the things the sun represents, which are purpose, mission, government, authority. So, it's just looking like, and the sun is in Ardra. So, there's some Ardra is represented by a storm cloud as well as tears. So I think the, authorities at large were having a difficult time and really quite upset because there probably wasn't a whole lot that they could do despite the dire situation. So that's this chart. So you can see how these energies played out in this particular case, and also at the time of this particular chart, the Dasha period or planetary period was Mercury, Saturn, Mercury. So, again, the seeking of answers, um, deep below, in the mind, in the psychology. And again, this represents not only the people on the ground trying to find solutions, but I'm sure represented also the people in the sub. So, and then again, Saturn, this massive Saturn, influencing quite a bit here. Yeah. So that's the sub. And then, my mind kind of went to the original Titanic. So let's take a look at that. So yeah, again, it was kind of funny how this all went down. My internal process as I was looking at this stuff, I'm not somebody who is like one of these like massive obsessed fans of this Titanic or whatever. I think I watched the movie two or three times. That's about it. But there was something about this, once I started looking at the sub, you'll see it's like I just started going down the rabbit hole of the whole original Titanic voyage, which was like, I mean, you'll see if you thought the slide I just went through was interesting. This is, I think, even more interesting. Um, but there was just something that kept pulling me in here. And I was even trying to figure out like this chart here, this is based on April 10th, 1912, 12 p.m. in Southampton, UK. So this was the moment that the original Titanic set sail from England. Um, And even that, like, for some reason, I started looking at the time that the original Titanic sank, which was April 14th, a few days after the voyage set sail. It was kind of 14th, 15th that happened right around midnight, like 23:40 on the 14th, up to about 2:20 in the morning on the 15th. It took about 2 hours and 40 minutes for the whole ship to sink. Um, and so I was looking at like, do I use the start time when it hit the iceberg, or do I use the end time when, it sank completely, or do I split the difference? And it was just very confusing. I was just like, why is this so confusing? And I couldn't seem to kind of find my way with it. And then I thought, oh, there must be Rahu and Ketu, which are the nodes of the moon, and they typically indicate things like these sort of bizarre, strange, hidden aspects. And so you'll see as I go through this that Rahu and Ketu are very important. So anyway, this is the chart. And let's try to go through again fairly systematically here, although you can see there's like a ton to go through. But in any case, so the first house, we always start there, the Lagna. It's a Cancer or Karka Lagna. It's in Pushya nakshatra. So Pushya is a nakshatra represented by the cow's udder. And I always think of Kobe beef when I think of nakshatra. Like it's a very nurturing nakshatra. It's a very supportive nakshatra. It's a very stable nakshatra. Um, Hospitable, Cancer. So we're talking like emotional goodness and home and just feel good, energy. And just like the Kobe beef, cows where they're like massaged and fed sake. So like to like relax the cows and make the cows happy, before they eventually go off to become somebody's dinner. But they have a good time before that happens, I guess. So anyway, and Cancer Karka is ruled by the moon. And the moon has gone to the seventh house of independent business. So that's not a surprise that the Titanic was a huge enterprise. And in the seventh house, the moon is in Uttarashada. Um, so that's also like a very victorious type of energy. Yeah. So there was this desire to make this huge, victorious enterprise. And again, it's the moon, which is represented by the public, and the moon, because it's the seventh house aspects to the first house back into its own sign. So it gives strength to the first house, and by way of the first house, the entire chart. So, it's like a big, not just like enterprise, but like a social, uh, more than social, like public enterprise. Like it was a big deal. Like everybody knew. Yeah, so it's not like just some big thing that happened in the corner of the world nobody heard about. It was clearly like a big publicity thing. Okay, so then what do we have on the Lugna as well? So we have this Jupiter in the fifth house. Jupiter is retrograde, and so there's some strength there. It's in Jyestha. So Jyestha is represented by authorities like law enforcement, that sort of thing, can be. But Jupiter itself as a planet represents things like optimism and opulence, travel. And just bigness, largeness. So, again, this was the largest ship that was ever built. So you have all of that energy, and it was like not just the biggest boat that ever hauled cargo, but it was the biggest, luxury travel boat. Like a cruise ship type thing, right? So you have all that energy coming from Jupiter. You can see that kind of yellow-orange arrow going into the Lugna there. What else is on the Lugna? We also have Rahu. We can take Rahu. We don't always take Rahu, but we can take Rahu because it's dispositor, the owner of the house in which it is, or the constellation in which it is Pisces, and Pisces is ruled by Jupiter, and Jupiter is aspecting Rahu, so you can take the fifth and ninth aspects of Rahu. So you have Rahu aspecting into this Lugna. So, ding, ding, ding. Okay. So there's your first little tip off. So something unusual is going on here. Now, it may just be that it's unusual because this is like the biggest, ship that's ever been built, going down in the Guinness Book of Records type stuff, and that can be Rahu energy. But if you also notice the degree position of Rahu, it has just recently shifted from Aries into Pisces. It's in the first degree of this, or the last degree of the sign. That means it's Sunday, we call it in Sanskrit, and it means that there's an inherent instability because the planet just shifted from the energies of one sign to another. So Rahu is going to bring some hidden, unexpected aspects besides the unexpected kind of how large and grand this thing was. There's a foreshadowing here. And Rahu is in Revati, which is a nakshatra that represents things like travel and hospitality. But again, there's this going to be from the planet itself, there's this unusual hidden nature. Yeah. Um, and then we also have Mars. Why do we have Mars? Because there's actually a parivartana, an exchange of houses between Mars and Mercury. So, with the exchange of Mars and Mercury, it brings Mars into the 10th house. And from the 10th house, it aspects four houses away into the Lugna. So Mars represents things like metals and fire and, um, pioneering, new, fresh, beginner pioneering energy. So all of that um, is going to come into the Lugna and the rest of the chart. But again, Mars is an erratic planet, so you might see things like sudden upheavals, cuts, injuries, that sort of thing. And the thing is, Mars is in the nakshatra of Ardra, and Ardra again is represented by a storm cloud, lightning, thunder, that sort of thing. So it can be the sudden shift and change. So you're starting to see like there is also, besides all the whoop-de-woo, wow, this is so exciting, this like massive, pioneering ship that's been built. You can start to see that there's other energies here which will undermine, the project potentially. But again, we'll see how that goes. So again, that's the Lugna. Then what do we have here? We have in the third house. So I think I went around the chart. So in the third house here, we have K2. K2, as I mentioned, the previous one, which is interesting. There's sort of a similarity here. K2, which can represent things like unusualness and dissociation, like separation, stuff like that. It's in Chitra. So again, the nakshatra that represents structures and architecture. And it has on it Mars. So again, the metals, fire, sudden kind of shift, change, collapse, energy, that sort of thing. And also the sun and Venus on it. So you can see that there's going to be potentially injury um, or to an unusual structure. Materials are going to be involved. Um, and communication is going to be involved because there is Mars in Gemini, and Gemini is ruled by Mercury, which are planet and constellation representing communication. And also because the third house represents communication. Venus also represents counsel, worldly counsel, like very useful counsel, that sort of thing, as opposed to spiritual counsel, Jupiter. And Venus, unfortunately, even though Sun is in Revati, which is again is hospitality, and travel, like Rahu, Venus is in, I believe it's Purva Bhadrapada. It might be Uttara Bhadra. It's no, it's actually Uttara Bhadrapada. I have it down below, which is represented by a funeral pyre. So, okay, so there's something there. Um, some probably negative energy there. Um, and Venus is actually going into, it's so close to the sun. Well, actually, no, I wouldn't say that. Let me take that back. Um, so that's the third house. So you can see that there's going to be this unusual kind of chaotic event that happens with structure, materials, communication, which, again, if you do know anything about the history of the Titanic, all those things are listed as reasons why the Titanic sank. Communication issues, and also the sun here represents authorities. So we had in the fifth house Jupiter and Jyestha, which represents some sort of authority or kind of law enforcement. And then you have the sun here too. So again, we have two indications already that the authorities involved here, um, there were difficulties with the people managing the situation and how they manage the situation. So then the fifth house we talked about already. So Jupiter, there's a Karko So interesting. So that means that there's going to be difficulty with things represented by Jupiter, um, such as authority, law, and finance. Um, and again, Jupiter's aspected by Mars. So Mars and Jupiter together again represents things like law, and Rahu is also aspecting here. So yeah, it's you're gonna have this unusual hidden aspect to it. Um, then Jupiter represents things like children as well. So then what do we have? We talked about the moon already. Then if we go to the ninth house again, so we have another Karko Bhavanasha because the sun is in which represents authority, fathers, that sort of thing, is in the house that represents the same. So you have another Karka. So there's two Karka Bhavanashas here. Um, and so again, this is going to represent things like difficulty with travel, government authorities, the whole mission, really. And the thing is, when I see this combination of Rahu, that's Sundi, so that's unstable, Sun, which is Karka Bhavanasha, and Venus, which is Uttar Bhadrapada, the energy I got from all this was unusual because Rahu's unusual, hidden things, Sun is authority, Venus is can be finance and the finer things of life. I almost kind of got from this energy of like somebody greasing the wheels, greasing the palms of authorities to make this project go. Maybe nepotism as well, because Venus can represent loved ones. So, this is a huge project. There's a lot of money on the line. There was a lot of reputation on the line. There's a lot of, we got to make this work, because it was all in the public eye. Um, and so again, I was getting the energy that, again, some things are happening on the administrative level, where all the checks that should have happened weren't happening. Money was getting passed, and again, greasing palms to kind of make things happen and happen by deadline. Because again, they were selling tickets for this whole thing to a bunch of rich and powerful people as well, primarily. So, um, and let's see what else. I wrote in here Shah. So, yeah, if you look underneath the chart here, I have below the time and place um, the data of the chart. I have the Dasha at the exact moment when the voyage sets sail. And you can see that you have Sun, Mercury, Saturn, Jupiter. So again, Sun, authorities, administration, potentially government, Mercury representing business, communication, Saturn, which is again slowness, delays, and that sort of thing. And Saturn happens to be debilitated here. And it's aspecting both Mercury, which represents business communication. It's aspecting Mars, which represents materials. Um, and it's Saturn is also representing the Gemini, which, if we do the exchange between Mars and Mercury is retrograde in its own house, that's usually when there's Mercury in its own house in a chart that can represent independent business. And this debilitated Saturn is and all that. You can just see this is like setting you up for a perfect storm here. And then Jupiter as well. So again, that even though there's this potential grace and glory that's going to come from this, Jupiter is Karkobhavanash as well, and it's in Jyestha. So again, it looks like there's structural issues, communication issues, and also at the administrative level of how this is all handled. And just as comparison, um, I wrote down just below it the Disha sequence on April 14th, so just a few days, so the day when the ship was hit. Look at what happened. Just in a few days, you shifted dashas quite significantly. So you're still in Sun dasha, but now you're in Sun K2 K2. And then in that day, it switched from Sun K2 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 to Sun K2 K2 Venus to Sun K2 K2 Sun. But you can see that this dasha sequence on the 14th is all about the 3-9 axis, the third house, nine house axis. And that's where I think the crux of the problem was, that ultimately sunk the ship. Um, and again, from an Vedic astrology point of view, when I was looking at, again, I'm not an expert on the Titanic, when I was just sort of looking up like, oh, what caused the Titanic to, sink and that sort of thing. There are all these sort of, in my mind, more superficial things like, there were problems with the metal, the content of the metal that was built most of the ship, and that was it not strong? No, it was too brittle. And so when it got hit by the iceberg, it just shattered. There are also communication issues with land, like there was some guy receiving the messages that didn't pass the messages on to the captain. So maneuvers away from the iceberg didn't happen in time, that sort of thing. Um, and there weren't enough lifeboats. So there are all these different issues. But um, again, when I see this Sun K2, 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 what it brings me to is that there are deep, hidden, unexpected, um, unseen things that happened within the administration even before the ship set sail that were really part of the problem. Because again, since we often see a lot of the stuff, and this isn't to, cause any shame or blame or whatever, but it's really to get to the root cause of why the ship sank. In this chart, it looks like the real problem was that the authorities who were building the ship, and administrating it to make it all happen and happen on time. Um, they were cutting corners or not taking into account really truly the safety of the passengers as much as they should have. They weren't doing enough checks on different things because it would have been more time, more expense, that sort of thing. Um, and put fear because they're trying to make this, in the public eye, this huge big thing, and all these, influential rich people are like buying tickets because it's so amazing. And if they start getting, if information starts getting leaked that wow, the metal that the ship is built from is actually too fragile or too it can't withstand impacts of of icebergs and things, which typically happen in North Atlantic. Then that's gonna, put the kibosh on this project pretty quickly. Just a whiff of that, in the news. Um, so yeah, and that's ultimately, I think, mm, besides the more superficial things that people talk about with the Titanic, that was ultimately the karma involved with why this happened the way it did. So that's a Dasha sequence. So again, you can see just even in the shift and in the Dasha sequence that Rahu and Ketu were important. Let's see. Where did I leave off in the notes? Rahu is Sunday. I talked about that. That makes it more unstable. Okay, so this is also super important. Rahu and Sun are almost in the same degree. So what that means is Rahu and Sun are like tightly woven together, and they're going to carry through all the amshas or the sub zodiacs, the sub micro zodiacs we call them, in this chart, and we'll see that in the next slide actually. The other thing, what that means too, is that, and you see Moon is just a few days away from joining the Sun here in Rahu. And because Sun is so close to Rahu, what that means is we're lining up for a complete solar eclipse. And when the Sun is eclipsed, that means there's no light in the Sun. And what that means is there's no light in any planet or any stars because the Sun is the light giver, the vitality giver of a whole chart. So basically, and when does that happen? Did I write that down? There's a total solar eclipse. I didn't write that down, but there's a total solar eclipse that happened on the 17th of April. So just a week after within a week after this ship set sail, there was a complete solar eclipse. And I'll go through that a little bit more in the next slide. Oh, I have a couple slides, so sorry. I think I'm mixing up the slides. Yeah, sorry. I've done this over the last weeks. Just there are so many things to put together. I'm trying to remember like all the thoughts and important things that came to mind as I was going through this. So Rahu and Sun right on top of each other. So again, ambitious but hidden aspects of authorities in this chart. Yeah. Um, no light. Venus, I mentioned, is exalted, which is great, but again, it's an Uttara Bhadrapada. So maybe part of what that did was that helped, again, it probably greased the wheels and caused corner cutting and the ultimate demise of the people who passed away. I think it was 1,500 people or almost that passed away on the ship. There were a few that were saved, so maybe there was a little bit of saving grace. But again, this exalted Venus, we're talking about more money, more partying, more good thing, but loss of loved ones. And again, this is in the ninth house of authorities. Yeah, so the authorities were probably, especially if palms were getting greased, to make this happen, and they got tickets to the boat or, the boat voyage or whatever. I mean, they were like, "Ooh, this is fantastic," but um, if they weren't truly thinking, for the best interest of the passengers, and they were just thinking about the glory, then they're gonna suffer. The project's gonna suffer. So the 10th house, Mercury's in Ashwini. Ashwini is again this nakshatra energy of saving, of rescuing, of that sort of thing. So, and Mercury is there, so communication. So, emergency communications like an SOS. That definitely happened. Saturn is in Bharani, which we mentioned in the last chart on the Titanic sub. Bharani is life and death, the womb. And because Saturn is a planet that represents death, you're going to veer more towards death, unfortunately. The sun is also debilitated here, so that's going to bring even more of the negative aspects of Saturn to light here in the situation. Saturn also represents structure. So if you have a debilitated structure, life and death, and that's aspecting Mars, which represents materials, and that doesn't make for a solid combination for a well-built ship that's going to take the brunt of a hit by an iceberg. And again, Saturn, Mercury, and Mars, because there is this exchange between Mars and Mercury. Mark, when you exchange those two, excuse me, Saturn and Mars together again, excuse me, can represent engineering. And that's going to be in the 10th house of career fame, but also these are going to aspect into the 4th house of history, legacy, and that sort of thing. Excuse me. I'm trying here with the liquids. um, yeah, and what else does it do? Oh, the other thing is that the Saturn aspects 10 houses away into its own sign of Capricorn, which is the 7th house of this chart. Um, so it's going to aspect the moon, which is the public. So there's going to be sadness, anxiety over the public, over the mind, and also the independent business here. So it's all looks like it's all going to come crashing down, unfortunately. Um, and again, with the Saturn Mars combination, there's going to be faulty metal structures and also electricity because Mars is in Ardra. And then the final house here, the 12th house, which is the house of loss, and also foreign places. It was a foreign voyage. You have Mars and Ardra, so there's going to be a loss of metal parts and electricity, which all happened. So that's the voyage, but we do need to qualify some of this stuff. So let's do that. All right, so I did want to qualify the solar eclipse that I mentioned that was going on in the Titanic voyage chart. Solar eclipse is also called surya grahan in Sanskrit. I have a whole teaching video on that if you want to know more about it. But eclipses in general bring a lot of chaotic energy because they really highlight um, Rahu and Ketu, which are planets that represent things like sudden unexpected events. So they tend to be pretty chaotic. So here are the um, eclipse charts for this time. So you can see this top chart here. This was a partial lunar eclipse that happened on April 1st, 1912, so about 10 days before the voyage set sail. And you could see all this pink stuff here. This is where the lunar eclipse can be seen. So typically where you can see an eclipse, there's going to be more of an impact of its energies. And so you can see clearly the area from the UK into the North Atlantic with this green arrow here. This is where the Titanic was sailing. So it's right in the middle of this energy. Um, oh, and I have the dates here. So the Titanic set sail on April 10th. It was hit on like right before midnight on April 14th, and then it sank early in the morning on April 15th. Then the second chart down below, this is the solar eclipse chart. Now, check this out. I mean, this is what blew my mind. So, because you can see with solar eclipses, there's a lot less area that's covered, and that's because the relative size of the um, Earth, moon, and sun. So again, if you see my video on eclipses, this will make more sense as to why the pattern of the of a solar eclipse is different from a lunar eclipse. But anyway, you can see that on the 17th of April, so again, look at the UK North Atlantic. It's almost exactly like it crosses like this little snake like um, um, pattern here is right over like the port where the Titanic set sail from. And it's a little bit south, but basically it's like going into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, I was just like, oh my God, I blew my mind. I mean, it's like, in a way, you couldn't get like a worse time to set sail from a Vedic astrology point of view, or place. Like, it was just a perfect storm. Yeah, so that was pretty mind blowing there. And then, oh, this was a sub-zodiac analysis. So we call it Amshavachara. So then I started digging into because I was like, well, okay, I can see the like optimism, opulence in the Titanic voyage chart. I can also see the kind of, the dun dun dun, sort of negative music, vibe kind of in there as well. Um, and so I started looking at the different subzodiacs where I would look to see to get more confirmation on the energies I was seeing in the natal chart. So I looked at the D9, the Navamsha, which is where you can ascertain the strength of the planets. Um, I looked at the D6, the Shashtamsha, which is a place where you typically assess like acute injury and illness. I looked at the D8, which is the Ashtamsha, which is where you typically assess chronic illness and injury. And then I also looked at the D30, the Trimshamsha, which is where you evaluate things like morality and ethics. So I'm not going to spend too much time here, or at least in my mind, too much time. Maybe in your mind today, she's like, wow, she's really going deep down this rabbit hole. I'm like, that's typically what I do. That's my style, I guess. Um, but so let's look at this top chart here and see what we see. So this top chart on the left, this is the D9 of Vamsha, so strength of planet. So look at what I circled here. So in the fifth house of counseling, you have the moon, the sun, and Rahu. You have a solar eclipse recreated in the D9. So all right, so again, I'm just like mind blown. It's all right there. So, there clearly was not good counseling through the authorities, and there were some hidden aspects there. And again, there's no light in this chart either. And again, I mentioned because the sun and Rahu are within a degree of each other, you're going to see Sun and Rahu together in almost every chart, sub-zodiac chart. You don't, I actually looked at all of them, you don't see them together, but in all of these charts, which are pretty important for assessing this event, analyzing this event, they're together. And yeah, and then you also have this exchange between Saturn and Mars. So you have a parivartana, exchange of houses between Saturn and Mars. It gives a little bit of strength to both those planets. But the thing is, when you have an exchange of Mars and Saturn, I don't typically like to see a parivartana between Mars because they're both malefic planets. And the thing is, they both have special aspects. So they don't just aspect, shine their light into the house opposite them. Saturn aspects 3, 7, and 10 houses away, and Mars aspects 4, 7, and 8 houses away. So when you have an exchange of Mars and Saturn, you're basically, most of the chart's going to be influenced by Mars and Saturn, and they're going to be strong because they're, exchanging their houses. So that's like, destruction, delays, that sort of thing. So the D9 not looking great. Then we go for across the way here to the top right. Again, I circled here. So you have Sun, Ketu, Rahu in the third house of communication. And that's again on this 3-9 axis here. So we're also looking at, and you have Saturn aspecting this as well. Yeah, it's just like, wow, it's just, wow. I mean, this is like a pretty intense chart here on every level. So you have Saturn aspecting here. So again, the planet that represents things like delays, obstacles, death, anxiety, depression, right on top of this potential solar eclipse that's happening in the third house. And in the sub-zodiac analysis, not the natal chart analysis, the third house is considered not only negative, but a house that's represented by that can represent change and endings. So that doesn't bode well. So that's again the D6, the Shatabhisha, so acute injury. So that's the like just the fact that they got hit by um, the iceberg. That's what I was looking at there. And then if we look at the D8, the Ashtamsha, this is the lower left part here, chart here. This is again where we assess chronic illness and injury. So what's the not just the impact, but how are potentially how can they record can they resist the impact or the injury. So looky here, we again have the Sun K2 Rahu combination. So again, more issues with Sun eclipsed, no light, and this is in the eighth house, which is chronic illness, injury, debt, um, bankruptcy, and then also the eighth house in the sub-zodiac chart analysis only, not in the natal chart. It's similar to the third house where it can represent things like changes and endings. So it's like, wow. And also the eighth house represents hidden, deep, dark places. So like the bottom of the ocean. So that's the D8 and then the D30. So this, so I was looking at just, again, more superficially, like, the impact, on the day of the crash and then the sinking and everything. But then again, because of this kind of, all the energies in the ninth house and the natal chart with the sun and Rahu and Venus and everything. And I was like, I think there's some nepotism or greasing of palms or something. People are cutting, the administration's cutting corners to make this project a go, not considering deeply enough the safety of the passengers. The D30, the Trim Shamsha, we look at morality and ethics. So look at what we have here. You recreate this solar eclipse, Rahu Ketu Sun in the ninth house. You have Venus aspecting it, so you have Venus again. I mean, I'm just like, my mind's just like, is this even possible? Like, You basically, okay, and then let's look at the whole, so that I was already like, oh my God, it's like complete, that 3-9 axis is basically the same. Let's look at the top here. So I circled the 12 at the top and the lugna for the subzodiac. So we're talking about Pisces. Pisces represents the ocean. Hello. It's represented by Jupiter. Jupiter's gone to the 11th house of easy money, income. But Jupiter, despite being retrograde and having strength there, is in Capricorn where it's debilitated. So hello. And Jupiter's aspecting into the fifth house where it was in the natal chart. Then the moon is in the seventh house again. I was like, wow, is this even possible? Um, then you have Saturn, exalted in the eighth house. So Saturn, being the planet that represents death, um, it's in the house representing death, and bankruptcy. The thing that was because Saturn is exalted in Libra, this is what it's going to give this, like, people are still obsessed with the Titanic. So this is something that even though it all went, kablooey and loss of life and all this kind of stuff, people are still obsessed with this. I mean, like 100 years, more than 100 years later. And then look, Mars, Mars and Mercury, if you do the exchange in the natal house, Mars is now in the 10th house again. Mercury is now in the 12th house again. Like, I was just like, oh my God, I just couldn't, I was like, wow, mind blown on every level. So again, what this represents to me is that, especially when you have an almost exact recreation of the natal chart in the D30, that's a very important subzodiac. And again, it all came down to morality and ethics, which, again, if we're talking about Vedic astrology, it's not about pointing fingers and this whole blame shame game, but it's just about looking deeply at what's going on. And it's just like, there's definitely some negative karma involved here. Um, yeah, so it's all there. You can see it for yourself. Okay, so as if that wasn't enough of me going all the way like deep into the pit of the rabbit hole here, because of this whole, administrative palm greasing morality, D30 trim shamsha, analysis and what I was seeing. Then my mind went to I know it's like this whole I was like I was getting obsessed with this. Like I was just like, wow, this is like all Rahu Ketu. So even just analyzing the chart for this Titanic thing, there was so much Rahu Ketu energy. Because again, that solar eclipse, total solar eclipse, and the Rahu and Sun being, about a degree apart. I was just like, wow, I'm getting sucked into this for sure. So, anyway, I think this is the last slide on the whole Titanic thing, but it's still interesting. If you're already done with the Titanic, just skip ahead to the next slide. But my mind went to, okay, so who is it like the top, of this whole thing? Like who financed this thing? Like who was potentially greasing the wheels here? And so actually John Pierpont Morgan, JP Morgan. If you don't know who he is, he was a extremely successful financier, investment banker. I guess today we call him a mergers and acquisitions expert, but he was immensely wealthy and immensely influential in the whole investments finance world at the time that the Titanic incident happened. And he had a ticket on this ship that he canceled a few hours before it set sail. So um, he wasn't there, but you'll well, let's go through his chart. So anyway, the data here, this is his Chandra Lagna, because I didn't have an exact time. Um, the time that was given, it was a quoted birth time, and the quoted birth information is 3 a.m. in Hartford, Connecticut on April 17th, 1837. And I have exclamation points here because April 17th was the day of the total solar eclipse when the Titanic before right after the Titanic sank. Oh, yeah. And so I looked up eclipse dates for 1837 when J.P. Morgan was born. There was a partial solar eclipse on April 5th. Like, you can't make this stuff up. On April 5th, and then there was a total lunar eclipse on April 20th, which you can see a few days after this, the moon is going to shift into the third house. It's in the first house here because I shifted it to the Chandra Lagna, the moon rising sign. And so the moon in a few days is going to be in this third house with K2, Saturn retrograde, exalted on the 3-9 axis again. And on the other side in the ninth house, you have Rahu, Mercury, and Sun. So what does this remind you of, folks? Hello, Titanic voyage chart. Um, yeah, so let's go through this. So the first house here is Leo Simha and Purva Phalguni. So Purva Phalguni, the moon is in Purva Phalguni, is all about, good times. Let the good times roll, like fun, family, relationships, socializing, the finer things of life. It's kind of a little bit of a party nakshatra. Um, but good, good times. So, that's good. Um, Leo is ruled by the sun and it's gone to the ninth house. So again, the sun is in Aries where it's exalted, so that's good. It gives it strength, but it creates another Karkobhavanasha. Um, yeah, yeah, and then the moon is in Purva Phalguni as well, and it's a bright moon, so that's nice. Brings some energy and strength to the moon, the mind. Um, but you can see this whole axis here, 3-9 axis. You have Sun, Mercury, Rahu, all in Ashwini. So, rescuing, healing, because the sun is so strong, you're going to have Rahu, so there's going to be this unusual aspect to it, ambitious aspect to it, but, sun exalted in the ninth house, I almost thought like it's almost like he himself was a government unto himself, which he essentially was, and we'll get into his history a little bit. You do also have a Buddhaditya yoga because the Mercury and Sun are together here, and that indicates like um, a very strong intellect, especially because it's qualified, because it's related. Mercury is the lord of the second house. So, what are we talking about here? So, if we're just looking at the Lugna and the Lugnatia, we're talking about a very strong king, leadership, healer, pioneer, successful, convincing also because this is all going on in the third house of communication. You also have Mars from the 12th house aspecting in the third house. So, there's going to be this guy's going to be courageous and a gambler for sure. And again, I just got this guy is so strong with such a strong sun, um, from this Chandra Lugna, position that I was, it's like again, like he's almost a sovereign nation himself. And what's also interesting, besides this being similar to the Titanic voyage chart, this is actually very similar to the current sky pattern because we have Rahu in Aries. We have Saturn aspecting onto Rahu, not from Libra, where it is in this chart, but from Aquarius. The other thing is that Libra represents things like the marketplace. So you have K2, so that's like destruction and kind of oddness there. K2's in Swati, so again, unstable structures. But you have Saturn and with the Mars aspect here, you have engineering. And Saturn is in Vishaka, which is victorious, and you have Mars in Aslesha. So again, sudden, unusual behaviors and stuff like that. So again, this guy's involved in unusual structure and reconstruction of businesses, and he's a gambler. He's got courage and chutzpah to make that happen. Um, so development of weak infrastructure I've listed here, metals, steels, unusual engineering. That's all this third house stuff going on for this guy. Then if we look at the eighth house, we have Venus combust and Revati. Now, Venus combust, so Venus for him, it's strong, it's exalted. Um, in Pisces, and Revati is again travel and hospitality and that sort of thing. Because it's combust, this Venus aspect is not something that he would necessarily display on the surface, but deep down, and again, the eighth house represents deep psychology. Deep down, this guy is a very hospitable guy. And you also have Jupiter, which is exalted in the 12th house, aspecting into this house as well. So you have Jupiter aspecting into its own sign of Pisces, bringing its strength. Um, and you have Venus here, and Jupiter is in also Aslesha. So there's going to be this, like, again, rescuing energy, hospitality deep down. This guy, even though on the surface he's like this like business magnate, like just just brilliant business mind, and deep down, his deeper motivations are about people, because Jupiter and Venus both represent people, hospitality, um, rescuing, and that's essentially what he did. Was he was rescuing through mergers and acquisition, consolidation of businesses and industries. That's essentially what he did. So again, I don't have an exact birth time, so I didn't have Amsha Vichara available to me. I couldn't go into the subzodiacs with this chart because I don't have an exact birth time, but my feeling based on what I'm seeing here is that this guy was a pretty good guy. So I don't think the things like the palm gracing and stuff that happened that probably sank the Titanic, at least from a karmic point of view, I don't think it was coming from JP Morgan, the guy at the top. I think it was coming from middle management who were probably um, had a different level of consciousness. Like, this is the kind of guy who I think I read somewhere, like he's just like, okay, we need a sports facility in New York, build it up, make it grand, spare no expense. Like, he wasn't a micromanager. I don't, he was a dreamer. He was ambitious. He was courageous. He had a prosperity consciousness, and that's what, again, this Venus combust in the eighth house in Revati with the Jupiter aspecting as well. We're talking about luxurious travel, hospitality. He's an unconventional thinker as well, because when you have strong eighth house like this, you can be an unconventional thinker. We also have this unconventional thinker energy coming from this Rahu, Ketu, Mercury lineup, because he's going to be a person who makes unusual decisions, um, and aspected by Jupiter. I mean, this is a guy who is like an epitome of prosperity consciousness. This is not somebody who's going to, I think, based on what I'm seeing here, cut corners to, save a few bucks at the expense of loss of life. Um, also, and also what's interesting here, I have this quote written underneath his birth date in the chart. This is a quote from his father. His father was very religious, and actually JP Morgan had a very disciplined religious life growing up. I don't know if he was able to maintain that, although he had association with, I think, the Episcopal Church. But this is a quote from his father that his father wrote to him in some letter when he was young and starting off on his own in the banking world. There's an eye above that is ever upon you, and that for every act, word, and deed, you will one day be called to give account. And what's interesting is that it's just, in a way, this is very similar to the notion of karma. And again, it's not from this, blame and shame, and, bad karma, and I hope somebody gets, their, just rewards, and I hope they sink because they sunk me. It's not about that. But it's about, every thought, action, and word that you produce is going to have some impact, and to be conscious of that and aware of that, I mean, gives people the opportunity to start shifting their life direction and their destiny pattern in a new direction. So if you keep it clean, um, that's the way to create, what most people consider better outcomes for themselves. So in any case, I just thought that when I was reading about JP Morgan, that was something that jumped out as like, if this is part of his basis of action in the world, and he followed this truly, then he was probably pretty well covered. And also this huge, conglomeration, this blue circle here in the ninth house, that's also his father. So, and it's the ninth house is also the house of punya or good karma. So it looks like JP Morgan, if nothing else, inherited a lot of good karma from his father, is what I'm seeing here. And the good karma is not just like, he made it, a bunch of money, but he had the kind of mind that would make decisions that would not only make him a bunch of money, but he saved a bunch of industries. He actually saved the United States because the United States is going bankrupt in the panic of 1907. He basically organized a bunch of high influence business people and bankers to essentially pool their money and save the, basically rescue the United States. So this idea of like sovereign nation onto himself is probably not too far-fetched, actually. But let's finish up the chart here. So then the 12th house, we have Mars debilitated with Jupiter exalted. So they kind of, if you've watched my Nicha Bunga video or debilitation breaking video, you'll understand that um, a debilitated planet with the planet that's exalted in the same sign actually helps to break, not completely break the negative effects of the debilitation. And they're both in Aslesha. So this is, again, especially with Jupiter being the stronger of the two planets, Jupiter's going to, which is a benevolent planet, an optimistic planet, a gracious planet, it's going to cover or influence this erratic Mars business. And also the 12th house is the house of hidden enemies. And it aspects into the sixth house of overt enemies. So this is somebody who I'm sure he had a lot of haters. I mean, everybody likes to hate, really, successful people. He was able to get them on his side or at least mitigate whatever damages that came his way because of them. And also, he's also going to be able to ameliorate any losses, financial losses, um, and materials. So again, if we're talking about the Titanic, he's going to be able to recover from this massive loss. I mean, he didn't go bankrupt because the Titanic sank. And I have in here, he owned, so his relationship in terms of financing for the Titanic, he owned the International Mercantile Marine that owned the White Star Line, and the White Star Line is the organization that funds the Titanic. Now, the thing is that this Titanic was under insurance by Lloyd's, and Lloyd's paid out 100 million pounds within 30 days of the Titanic getting sunk. Um, so he bounced back. um, and he didn't get on the ship either. So and again, this guy was so influential. I mean, with his mergers and acquisitions, we're talking US Steel, General Electric. I mean, these are businesses that still exist and are still global corporations. The railroads, American railroads, and also and some people credit him with single-handedly rescuing the United States from the panic of 1907. But again, what I'm getting from this guy is that he's a pretty good guy. So I don't think it was coming from the top. All right, so that's finally the end of the Titanic. Okay. Yeah, Rahu KT really took me on a ride, I think, with that. But now let's actually get into the transit dates for the upcoming month of July. So the moon, there's going to be a full moon on July 3rd. What is that, tomorrow, I think, in Sagittarius Danu in Purva Shada. The moon is neutral in Sagittarius and it's a dual fire sign. So there's going to be a lot of enthusiasm and action here, but potentially in two different directions. So, and this moon is being aspected by the Sun and Mercury in Ardra, Rahu in Ashwini, and Jupiter in Bharani. So, Ardra is, and Sun and Mercury are in Gemini. So they're going to be dominated by Mercury. And Mercury in its own sign can often indicate things like business, independent business, entrepreneurial activities. Ardra can again is symbolized by a storm, cloud, electricity, thunder, lightning, that sort of thing, and also teardrop. So again, if we're talking about two different stories here, this could be something related to the mind coming to some sort of epiphany about business or friendships, that sort of thing. Rahu is also aspecting the Sagittarius as well as Jupiter at this time. And so there's going to be this characteristic of, again, healing, rescuing, and life and death. So there's some sort of, well, let me talk about the nakshatra and it'll make more sense, I think. So the symbol for the nakshatra of Purva Shada is a winnowing basket. So it's kind of like, this basket where you put in the wheat and then you kind of shake it, and then slowly the chaff comes off, the outer husk comes off, so that you can actually get a wheat kernel that you can actually cook. That's not too tough to eat for your guts, digestive system. The deity here is Apa, which is water deified. The other name for Purvashada is Parajita, and it means undefeated. So there is a sort of victorious energy of the moon during this full moon. And again, the full moon, when it's full, it's at its strongest point because it has the most light from the sun. So there's usually epiphanies, emotional epiphanies, and mental clarity that comes about during that time. Because it's in Sagittarius, it's going to be related to things like philosophy, travel, nature, spirituality, work, potentially, because the sun is involved here and Mercury is involved here. Because of Rahu and Jupiter, you're going to have this renewed sense of hope, sudden insight. So there's probably something going on that's been difficult to deal with, some sort of thing that needs to be corrected. And so slowly by sifting, the sort of sifting process with the mind, there's going to be some sort of mental or emotional breakthrough to move the project or thing forward. On July 17th, there's going to be a new moon in Cancer, Karka, Punarvasu. So it's a new moon. So the new moons are not strong, but the moon is in its own sign. So it's going to be an exaggerated moon. It's in Punarvasu, which again is symbolized by a quiver of arrows. So this energy of being in one place and venturing out and coming back home. The deity of this nakshatra is Aditi, the goddess of Vedas, limitless, noble type of energy. Cancer is a movable water sign, so it's active and emotional. And because the moon is going to be here, it's going to dominate the sun and Mercury, which will be there at that time. So it's going to be some of this more rational, logical mind that happens at the full moon on July 3rd is going to shift into more of an emotional space and more of a, thinking of the public, thinking of home, potentially even thinking about mothers and motherly energy and nurturing, that sort of thing. Um, it's going to be conjoined with the sun, which is going to be in Punarvasu, so some sort of mission work where, again, things that are going back and forth. There's a home base, then you go out and come back again. And Mercury's going to be in Aslesha, so there's going to be some, sudden communication or decision that's made that's actually going to be potentially healing in nature. But again, this is related to the emotional body, the emotional space. So, after kind of ruminating, with this back and forth energy of the sun and the moon, there's going to be a sudden clarity of emotions and kind of a release of emotions. That typically what happens with the new moon in Western astrology. And I'm no expert on Western astrology, but in Western astrology, they do have this concept of what's called the balsamic moon, which is like the last few degrees before the moon catches up with the sun, before it starts waxing again. And those last few moments before the moon conjoins the sun, it's like the completion of the emotional cycle, and so there's like an emotional release. And so sometimes, a lot of times, there's an emotional release that happens, and it can be kind of bittersweet and balsamic like vinegar. So there's this kind of acidic quality to it in terms of emotions right before a new moon happens and starts growing again. So again, this ruminating on possibilities and sudden clarity of emotions support sudden decision making. And again, this is related to career and purpose moving forward. But this is about like, whereas the full moon is more about integrating how do we save this project and business and that sort of thing from more of a philosophical point of view and more of a rational, logical point of view. Once we move into this new moon, it's going to be more about, well, how do I really feel about this, though? Like maybe it looks good on paper, but how do I really feel about this? So whether this project is about work or some other life direction, that's the energy here. So then Mercury, that's going to be zipping around pretty fast in July. On July 3rd, Mercury enters Punarvasu nakshatra. That's still going to be in Gemini, so it's still going to be strong. It's a strong Mercury. The mind is going to venture out and return to home base. Again, this is more of a theoretical, probably business related thing. Not necessarily, but it's more the practical, rational, logical aspects of a project, whatever it may be, even if it's not business or work related. Again, we're weighing options. It's going to be energized by the sun there. The moon's in Sagittarius, as I mentioned. So we're going to be considering like, it's going to bring in not just like the kind of nuts and bolts, like accounting type aspects of a project, but what's the deeper kind of nature philosophy that we want to bring in here to um, drive movement forward? Yeah. On July 8th, Mercury enters Cancer Karka. So again, it's going to slow down because Mercury's not so comfy. The logical mind is not so comfy in the emotional world. That's what Cancer is. It's going to be more sentimental, but probably awkward. Yeah, maybe even communications might be awkward about emotions and stuff like that. July 9th, Mercury enters Pushami nakshatra. So the thinking is going to become more grounded, nurturing, because that's Pushya, the cow's udder. I mentioned that nakshatra earlier in this talk. July 13th, Mercury leaves combustion. So Mercury has been combust. So again, all of this has been going, this mental sifting and processing and stuff that I mentioned both in the previous slide and this one. It's all been pretty much underground. It's all internal. So once Mercury leaves combustion on July 13th, you might actually get outward expression of all this thinking and culling through thoughts and ideas. So you might get speaking and organizing support for friends, colleagues, customers, aunts and uncles that might see random, or somebody out there that probably makes sense. Because those are the things that Mercury represents. So we're going to get some action related to all the thinking that's been going on. July 16th, Mercury enters Aslesha nakshatra. So again, we're going to, now there's going to be a little bit of a twist and turn with Mercury because that's just the nature of Aslesha. Again, it's that snake energy. So you might get sudden surprising words or info, clarity, and decision making to remedy a situation. At that time, I believe and that should be on the better side of things because Moon, I believe, is just about in entering that new moon is happening in Cancer at that time. So again, there's going to be it's going to bring positive energy to this. July 24th, Mercury enters Leo or Simha and Magha nakshatra. So then we're moving from the emotion. So once we've thought, worked it out on paper, and then we thought, kind of figured out like how do we really feel about this, then it's time to bring this out in the open to a public stage of some sort. And because Mercury's entering Leo, where Mars and Venus are, and those are passion planets, this is going to be some sort of passion project or relationship. Like this might be something like going Instagram official or something with, a relationship or, putting your business idea out in the public, creating a website or something like that. So it's going to be infrastructure building because you also have um, the Saturn aspecting into Leo at that time, and it's going to be aspirational. Because you have Jupiter and Rahu aspecting. So there's going to be this conglomeration of planets in Leo coming up this month. But it's going to be aspirational, but yet traditional because you have that strong Saturn on things. And Magha, I haven't mentioned too much about Magha, but Magha is symbolized by a throne. So there's this notion of like royalty and nobleness. Magha is also the heart of the lion, the star that represents the heart of the lion. If you look at the constellation, and this is in Vedic culture where our ancestors reside once they've passed on. So there is this notion of tradition and lineage and ancestral um, line, but also support here. Yeah. And then there's going to be a little bit of drama. Looks like at the end of the month, the 26th through 28th, Mercury and Venus are going to be in planetary war. I do have a video on that, graha yuddha. And then Rahu is going to be an exact aspect of Mercury somewhere in there. So then we're going to get, headbutting between Mercury and Venus and the things that they represent. So head versus heart, business versus love, logic versus creativity, friend versus lover. And then right around that time, Venus is going to go retrograde, eventually combust at the end of the month. So, um, yeah, Mercury's going to keep moving forward, and Venus is going to do some revisions. So that's Mercury and the journey of the mind, the rational decision making mind through July. Then we have this Venus, Shukra, Mars, Mongol story going on in July. I think it's mostly going on in Leo, right? Yeah, it's all going on in Leo pretty much. So July 6th, Venus enters Leo. Mars just left Cancer, so Mars is already in Leo at this time. So Venus enters Leo, Simha, and also Magha nakshatra all at the same time because those are aligned. It's an enemy sign, the Sun, but it's going to be conjoined with Mars, aspected by Saturn, Rahu, and Jupiter. So there's going to be passion, but there's going to be engineering, and there's going to be ambition, and there's going to be opulence, like in Magha. So this might actually be, again, a promotion, a work promotion, or it might be like an upgrade. It can be an upgrade with a vehicle. That's what Venus represents. It can also be an upgrade with a relationship because Venus represents relationships. Um, it could be some because Venus and Mars have been in Cancer and they've been in Aslesha, and Mars was debilitated in Cancer in Aslesha. So it might have been the last week or so, couple weeks, you know, relationships were not, moving forward seamlessly. And so there's an opportunity here to kind of re-engineer things and bring them upgrade or up level them, and potentially even provide a commitment. Because when you have Mars and Venus, that's a passion combination, lust and love. But then Saturn is about longevity and long term, commitment, that sort of thing. So, and Venus also represents bringing worldly counsel and the human element into engineering. So, whatever project there was, now it's about bringing in the kind of bells and whistles, adding the bells and whistles and the decoration and the icing on the cake, basically, and the human element. You know, on July 10th, Mars, which is in Magha at the time, is going to be an exact aspect with Rahu. Rahu, again, Mars is innovation, pioneering. Rahu is in um, Aries, so there's going to be a lot of fire here, especially because this is all in Leo, a fire sign. So there's going to be a lot of drive here, a lot of action here. Um, um, Mars in Leo, because it's ruled by the sun, it's a friend sign. Again, it's conjoined with Venus and Saturn, and aspected by Saturn as well as Jupiter. Um, because Rahu represents sudden, unexpected, hidden things, you might see a sudden, unexpected, unusual directive change in your path. Um, so there's going to be a little curveball thrown into this. Even though things were worked out on paper and you went through the process of figuring out how you feel, there's going to be a curveball. It looks like it's coming through here. And again, because this is related to Leo, this could be about pushback from the public or public response to whatever this project is. Um, that's a possibility. July 20th, Mars, there's going to be an exact aspect with Saturn. there's also going to be a party of arcana between the sun and the moon at this time. So there's going to be exchange between Cancer and Leo and the planets that represent them or rule them. So again, Mars and Saturn together, engineering, possibly re-engineering purpose or mission, public sentiment, emotions. Um, because now Moon, even though Moon is in, even though the Sun is in Cancer, it's going to get pulled into this mix here, and there's going to be some strength, but also some tension. What's going on here? And the thing is, because Saturn is in all of this, it's going to be a Saturn dominated chart, and Saturn is retrograde in its own sign in Aquarius. And the only planets it's not going to be touching at that time are Mercury, Ketu. So, and Saturn's in Shatabhisha. So there's going to be some, again, difficult to remedy situation. So it's kind of like, even though things were worked out on paper and you work through your feelings about it, it's sort of like, this is where the rubber meets the road, where, it's like theory, it's like your great idea is like, okay, now we got to work out reality, into this. And that may be part of why in this next part here, July 22nd, Venus goes retrograde. Venus is the worldly counselor. It's the, practical counselor advisor. Um, and it's aspected by Rahu. It gets pretty close to exact aspect, but it goes retrograde before it meets that exact aspect. So it's going to retrograde back in Cancer. So it's kind of like a little bit of back to the drawing board of how do we, we had this great idea, we thought it all through, on a logistical basis as well as a personal basis. And we were like ready to, light up the world with it. But then something happens where it's like, it's probably again, no go for some reason. And so you got to kind of go back to the drawing board to figure out, how to make it work. Right. Mars is also moving into Purva Phalguni nakshatra, which is again, Purva Phalguni, that should sound familiar from JP Morgan's chart. It's more of a party, more of a party nakshatra, good times, let the good times roll, food, wine, socializing, that sort of thing. Also marriage potentially. But again, Venus is going retrograde. So all of this drive to level up and get things done and, all that, get this commitment, then there's this sort of like, how do I say, a shift in energy where things may soften. You might lose inertia a bit and possibly even like literally go on vacation because this is going to be the time, we're getting close to August. That's typically a time, at least in the northern hemisphere, when people are on vacation, summer vacation. In the southern hemisphere, I'm not sure, it's winter vacation for, I think, a lot of kids down there. So at least they're getting off. I don't know when exactly it happens in the southern hemisphere, but there are holidays going on down there, yeah. Or at least holiday time, even if it's not like Christmas or something. So, while there's this review of how to make this stuff happen, there might be, again, a little bit of kind of relaxation until some new idea or advisement comes into place here. And again, that planetary war I mentioned is happening 26th to 28th of July. So again, we're talking luxury versus economy, friends versus acquaintances, love versus business. Those two things coming up against each other. Um, and then July 30th, Venus goes combust. So all that social grace that Venus brings to situations is going to go underground, is going to be eclipsed. And it's going to be eclipsed. Venus is going to be eclipsed until August 18th. So the things that Venus represents are going to be eclipsed. So this could be, it's also in retrograde at this time. So again, it's going to be a deep dive or review of heart and feelings about things, friendships, relationships. And you may not outwardly see spouse, lover, art, vehicle, social grace. Typically, customer service, I've noticed customer service is pretty horrible when Venus goes combust. People just aren't very nice to each other in a very simple way. Um, they're not giving people the benefit of the doubt or sort of thing. And but if Venus is combust, maybe your lover goes on a business trip or has to go back and do something related to family because Venus is going back to Cancer, which represents family. Venus also represents art and vehicles, so maybe somebody borrows your car or something for a couple of weeks, or your car is, broken or some breaks down, and so you have to take the bus instead. Or and if you're an artist, it may be that you're reconsidering maybe a new tact with your direction for your art, but you're not actually producing that much art. You're thinking about it or contemplating it, but not really. It's not really getting out there. So that's Venus and Mars. All right, so that's most of the aspects for the month. I have a few more, but I did want to go through this because this is pretty exemplary for its embodiment of the current sky pattern, the energies of the current sky pattern. And this is the national chart of Canada. The current configuration, administrative configuration of Canada happened on July 1st, 1867. So happy birthday to Canada yesterday. Bon anniversaire. And then I guess technically that happened at midnight that day in Ottawa. So I have two charts here. The chart on the left is the national chart of Canada, and the chart on the right is the Samaya chart or the update chart. So that's the chart that we create or cast at the time of analysis of the chart because it gives us an update of the karma for the chart they're analyzing. And the Samaya chart data, this was almost the same. It's 5 minutes into July 1st of 2023. Okay, so let's go through again. We're going to start at the top here. And as you see already, I probably don't have to say much, but you can already see that there's a lot of similarities here, but important differences as well. So let's go through. Um, and the reason also, besides it being Canada's birthday, the reason why I put this up is because of the fires, forest fires going on in Canada, and that's making world news because smoke from the fires is blowing down the United States, but also recently has been blowing into like Europe. And it's a pretty big deal for Canada itself, our neighbor to the north here. So let's go through. So Canada's chart, it's ruled by Pisces or Mina. And the ruling nakshatra is Revati. So again, hospitality and travel. It's ruled by Jupiter, which is in Shatabhisha. That's a nakshatra indicating things that are difficult to heal typically, or it can be healing. And because it's Jupiter, which is the great benefic, potentially we see great healing here, but it's also conjoined with K2, so hidden, unexpected things. It's also aspected by Mars, which is like, if we're talking about medical stuff, infections, injuries, that sort of thing. So, despite Jupiter bringing some grace to things, there's also some hard aspects here, hard energies here. And Jupiter's gone to the 12th house of freedom. So if we look at that time in 1867 of Canada's history, this was a time when a lot of people were coming over from Europe and establishing their own way. Yeah, and they were going to Canada because of various types of freedom, economic freedom, religious freedom, that sort of thing. K2 is in Purva Bhadrapada, which is the front legs of the funeral cot, and K2 represents separation. So that doesn't bode well, especially since the 12th house is related, not just the reason why I said freedom here is because the 12th house is a um, um, moksha sthana, which is a motivation of like freedom and stuff like moksha is freedom, not just like physical freedom and mental freedom, emotional freedom, but also spiritual freedom. But also it's the house of loss and expenditures. So, so there's a destruction here, destructive energy here. And Jupiter, as I mentioned before, represents things like biology um, and nature and human life. So there's a loss here. And this is probably not only loss of the people coming over, but it was loss of the native indigenous people who already live there. and we'll get into that as well. There is also this aspect of Mars from the sixth house. The sixth house represents enemies, and Mars is the planet that represents enemies. So there was a lot of strife here. And also, Mars is in Magha. So this nakshatra that's symbolized by the throne and ancestors. Also, I should mention, because this is a Pisces lugna, Pisces is a dual sign. So there's going to be two stories for everything you see here. Yeah. So Mars again represents enemies. So the king might be an enemy, literally, and that might be why some of these people left Europe, primarily Europe, to come to Canada, which is true. But also, Magha represents ancestors. So you can actually make enemy of the ancestors of the land. And so I think both of those things were true in this chart. Enemies of the king and also enemies of the native people who were there already. Um, the Dasha sequence when Canada was born, based on this chart, was Saturn, Saturn, Rahu. So those planets and their energies and the houses they represent, which Rahu doesn't represent, but Saturn does, is also going to be important. So Saturn is the lord of both the 10th house of income and gambling, right? Which it was a gamble to cross the world, start a new life. And also the 11th house, it's also the ruler of the 11th, or sorry, the 12th house of losses, expenditures, and also foreign places. So, and Saturn happens to be in the eighth house of death, of bankruptcy. So again, it was risk taking here. It happens to be exalted retrograde, so it's a strong Saturn. Saturn also represents things like death, delays, obstacles. So it wasn't easy by any means. And also the eighth house can represent things like deep, dark places, such as underground. And Saturn could represent underground, and Saturn could represent minerals and land. So excavation, like the gold rush, and also mining, those are important things going on here. And also the Jupiter K2 combination of the 12th house, because this could literally be destruction of or cutting down, I guess if you want to say it nicely, cutting down of biology, so trees and wildlife, because of the timber industry that grew up there. Um, it can also represent, because again, you have K2, Rahu, Mars, and that sort of thing. This can also represent things like unusual biological diseases such as measles and smallpox, which again created the loss of life, not just of the people coming over from Europe, but obviously the indigenous people who were there who had no immune resistance to these strange pathogens. Um, yeah, so let me just see. Did I cover most of it? Yeah, so loss of life, nature, foreign lands export. Yeah, so this is all the Lugna and Lugnatia, sudden, unexpected, difficult injury, disease, land, indigenous people. Just yes, okay. So the Samaya chart. So again, I oriented this to Pisces so we could do a side by side comparison. And what you might notice is that you get basically Jupiter, Rahu, Saturn, K2, Mars. All these planets, they're slightly differently configured, like they're in different houses, but basically they're still in 2, 6, 8, and 12. 2, 6, 8, and 12. So there's a little shuffling that happened, but 6, 8, and 12 are generally considered negative signs. Like sixth house is enemies, acute injury, eighth house is chronic disease, death, bankruptcy, 12th house is losses, expenditures, that sort of thing. So there's a lot that's similar here. Even there's a little bit of shuffling. Mars in the semi chart is in Magha again. Just recently, again, shifting out of Cancer. You can see it's in the first degree of Leo. And from that position, Mars, Magha, aspects the Lugna. So there's this pioneering energy, there's this innovative energy. It can also bring this noble quality, um, but also like enemies and stuff like that. Because again, Pisces ruled by Jupiter is a dual sign. So, uh, yeah. let's see what else. And then Jupiter, instead of being in the 12th house, Jupiter's now in the second house. So that's probably better in some ways because second house is positive house. So Jupiter's going to be stronger there. But Jupiter's in Bharani, so life and death. And because Jupiter is a benefic planet, we're talking more about probably life than death. But you have this really strong retrograde Saturn from the 12th house aspecting this Jupiter. Jupiter is conjoined with Rahu. Yeah, so there's going to be this suppression by Saturn. So again, there's still this loss of um, foreign goods, exports, trade related to um, Jupiter. So again, biology, land, nature, animals, biological products like wood, timber. And then again, this Jupiter is aspecting the eighth house where K2 is. K2 is in, what is K2 in? K2 is in, I want to say Chitra. What is it in Chitra? I believe it's in Chitra. Did I not write it down? I believe it's in Chitra, which again is uh, it's in it's about architecture and stuff like that. So again, that's eighth house, all underground stuff. So again, that's like excavation and mining and stuff like that. And Jupiter is also philosophy. So we're also bringing in philosophy here. The thing that was with Jupiter moving into the second house instead of the 12th house, now the main motivation of the nation is not so much freedom, so much as material wealth building. Because the second house is Artistana. Artistana, it's a wealth building house. So the primary motivation is shifting. Um, the other thing is that I have this, you can see this like curve, black curve, going from Saturn to Jupiter in the second chart here. The reason why I put that there is because, well, it's actually Saturn to Rahu, should be Saturn to Rahu. Saturn and Rahu, because you have two malefic planets flanking the Lagna, that's going to create what we call a Papakarshra yoga. So that's going to bring a lot of burden to the first house. And because the first house influences all the rest of the chart, it means the whole chart, the whole nation is going to see burden here that's going to be difficult to sort through, especially because Saturn's so strong in Shatabhisha. You can see in the natal chart here, the 1867 chart, there is also a flanking of, again, Mars, Rahu, and Saturn, but around the seventh house. So the seventh house represents independent business and relationships. So back when Canada got started as a formal nation, again, modern nation, not necessarily independent, indigenous culture nation, um, the difficulty, there was burden on creating independent business and relationships, again, because of the newness of the place and the, frankly, a lack of disrespect between cultures and the way of doing things, the kind of mentality of doing things and sort of taking things over and that sort of thing was clashing with indigenous culture. But you see there's a similar pattern, like Mars is on the throne, enemies, Rahu, there's ambition here, K2 destruction, Saturn, death and loss, Jupiter expansion, nature, law, people. But again, we're moving to the second house of material wealth building. Um, but again, it's in sixth house, eighth house, 12th house, which I mentioned already. So that's very similar between these two charts. And there's more to go through, but I couldn't fit all on one side. So let's go to the next slide for more. So these are the same charts and mock-ups, all the lines and drawings and everything, but I just have different text to go through the rest of the chart. So if we go back to the native chart, 1867 chart on the left here, we'll just kind of go through the houses and see. So on the third house, you have Venus at Swa, so it's strong. The third house is about communication. It happens to be in Mrigashirsha nakshatra, so it's a seeking chart, seeking star that it's in. And you can see if we compare it to the Samaya chart on the right, Venus is then now in the fifth house of counseling. So back in the day in 1867, what that tells me is that there's a lot of this sort of sweet talking that happened, but it was kind of like finding the right words to basically maneuver oneself into a top position. Was what I'm seeing in the 1867 chart. And then the modern chart, Venus is in the fifth house of counseling. So again, the worldly advisor, the practical advisor of Venus is now in the house of counseling. So that's actually, I think, pretty good news. So rather than doing kind of a smoke and mirrors dance to one up people from a different culture and kind of, manipulate that, we're looking for practical answers. And also because Venus is the sign that represents social grace, it looks like one of the main differences between these two charts is now there is more of a consciousness of trying to build bridges and appease people rather than just overlord them. Yeah, and grab what you can. Yeah. So the thing that, and the other thing is in this both charts, Venus is not in direct play with any other planet. So Venus isn't shining its light on any other planets, bringing more of that social grace and more practical wisdom. Yeah, so then if we look at the fourth house, now this is pretty interesting. You can see this big green circle in both charts, and it's pretty similar here. So in the 1867 chart on the left, the fourth house represents again things like ancestors, traditions, mother, home. Um, and you have moon and sun here in Ardra. So moon represents mother, sun represents father. In Ardra, again, we've talked about that nakshatra a bunch of times already today. Um, it's represented by a storm cloud, lightning, electricity, but also teardrops, raindrops and teardrops. So again, since we're talking about a dual sign, Pisces that rules the whole chart, hanging in there best I can, trying to keep my throat lubricated so I can finish this talk. We're almost there. So if we're talking about people, I very much see this as um, moon and sun as mother and father, ancestors. Like we're talking about indigenous people here, and teardrops being their sadness with seeing how things are changing with the influx of immigrants from Europe. So again, not to get all depressing here, but again, I think there is light at the end of the tunnel, at the end of this analysis. So hang with me. And again, this isn't about shame and blame. This is about just what we call intelligent regret. When we're looking at our own previous actions and we're trying to assess, like, why are certain situations coming up in my life that I find are negative or hard to deal with? Like, what's the energy or karmic legacy that's brought that into my experience? And so that's all we're doing here. But at the time, it does seem that, and again, I believe in Native American culture. I'm not an expert, so tell me if this is off base, but they used to call the earth mother and they used to call the sky father, right, in Native American culture. And so even the land and the sky was sad from the transition because with this influx of immigrants, just seeing, like, with dollar signs in their eyes or Canadian dollar signs in their eyes, I guess, um, looking at all the natural resources and just the bounty, natural bounty. But then they went about, chopping down trees and making money from timber and digging up the land for gold and petroleum and gas and things like that. Um, there was sadness here, both for the people and the natural resources from that perspective. If we actually look at this from more specifically, like forest land, since again, we're bringing this into modern times and got the forest fires going on. Sun represents big, massive, grand trees, which Canada has quite a few of, yes, and that's what's burning down currently. The moon represents trees that have a lot of sap, so like pine trees and things like that, and also maple trees, right, for the syrup, which Canada, is a major producer of. Then we have this parivartana, this exchange of houses between Mercury and Moon. So that brings Mercury into the fourth house. Mercury represents fruitless trees. So, Canada makes money off trees that aren't fruit producing, but that have a lot of sap and that are these huge trees for lumber. Yeah, and because these are in Ardra, there's electricity because there's a lightning bolt, that's part of the symbolism is a lightning bolt. But literally, this can be electricity, such as like cutting things down with a saw, electric saw. But what I was reading about earlier today was that half of the forest fires in Canada are actually created by lightning. And then the other half are created by things like sparks off of railroads. So again, sparks, lightning in a way, fire, and cigarette butts. So half of fires. And the thing is, 85% of the destruction of land from forest fires happens from the 50% that's generated or created or sparked off by lightning bolts from the sky. So I was like, wow, that was like just, and it's all there in the chart. That's pretty amazing. Um, so let me just make sure I'm not missing too much here. So I think yeah, so again, the fourth house, ancestors, traditions, moon, sun, I talked about all that. So if we move over to the update chart on the right here, you can see Mercury and Sun are recreated, and they're both in Ardra again. So fruitless trees, grand tree, lightning, fire, it's right there. It's amazing, right? So then, and the thing though too is that, in both charts, especially when we do the Parivartana between the Mercury between Mercury and Moon, and we get Mercury back into the Gemini, its own sign, and we have Mercury and Gemini right now in the update chart, we're talking about independent business. So, and that energy is going to aspect in the 10th house of um, career, but it's also going to strengthen the seventh house of independent business because even though Mercury's not there, that's going to make in both these charts the seventh house is ruled by Virgo and Virgo's ruled by Mercury. So if you have a really strong Virgo and by way of a very strong Mercury, that's going to increase independent business. Yeah. So I think I covered it all. Yeah, tears, business, fire, chemicals, lightning, emotions, lot. Yeah. So, and the other thing is in this first chart in 1867 with this Parivartana between Mercury and Moon, we have this tension and between Moon, the mind, the emotional mind, and Mercury, the rational mind. And so those were the things that were at play here. It's sort of like um, a logical, rational mind decisions, as well as like emotional decisions, but not necessarily like a social good decisions. It wasn't looking at social goods, like how can we integrate and incorporate and join forces and build bridges. It's how do we like, grab what we can for ourselves, essentially. Um, and as I mentioned, we've got the Mars Rahu. We still have that in the sixth house in both charts moving through. Eighth house, again, we have Saturn retrograde exalted in this first chart. We have K2 and Jupiter aspecting. So again, similar to what we have going on right now. Um, yeah. So then I think if we move to the ninth house in both these charts, the ninth house again represents things like government, authority, spirituality. In the first chart, we have Mars and Magha aspecting this house. So again, Mars being the leader, chief of staff, like CEO type energy, leader of the army, leader of the military, leader of that sort of thing. Um, it's in Magha, so that's also the throne. So that's interesting. So and Mars aspecting into the eighth house, the ninth house here, that's in Scorpio. So there's going to be a transformation of leadership, especially military leadership, in this first chart here. So there was this sort of, really hostile takeover, is how you could see it. The thing that was, I think, one, besides the Venus shifting positions, the other thing that I thought was crucial in these two charts, even though they're so similar, is that you now have Moon in Anuradha in the ninth house of government and authority. Moon Anuradha, well, one, Moon is basically a bright, almost a full moon here. So that gives the moon strength, which is great. So the moon is going to be more emotional, intuitive, that sort of thing. But Anuradha, that's a fantastic nakshatra because Anuradha is a victorious nakshatra, but it's represented by victory that's gained through building bridges rather than, a victory at all costs. So, even though the Saturn, this massive Saturn in the 12th house of losses and it's retrograde in its own sign, so this massively strong Saturn is aspecting into this house also in the updated Samaya chart. So there's difficulties here, but the general consciousness of the government and of Canada now, if it's willing to, I mean, again, besides just literally trying to put these fires out, just quench the fire. Like clearly that needs to be done. But if they're willing to, and if they allow themselves to, if they look deeper at, again, if we're talking about karma here, if they're looking at like how much destruction of the land has gone on. And the thing is, I listed down here too, is like the three major industries of Canada are real estate, mining, and manufacturing. Those are all heavy duty, those are all going to take a heavy duty toll on the planet, on nature. And the five biggest exports for Canada are petroleum, cars, gas, gold, and sawn wood. So again, earth, natural resources, and then manufacturing, which are going to have major impact on the planet and nature. Um, what I saw here is that the current level of consciousness of the government, of the people of Canada, is a higher one where they're thinking of the public good, where they're at least they have the capacity to think about the public good, to think about building bridges, rather than come in and dominate by hostile takeover. How do we integrate, especially now because there's so many different cultures. It's not just European culture, but so many different cultures around the world. It's a very multinational cultural country at this point. And so there's more awareness and consciousness of the deeds that have gone on before, and that they're willing to look at better ways of doing things moving forward. That they have the capacity, even though it would be difficult, to think about how to restructure again, this whole Mars, Saturn, Rahu, Jupiter combination, restructure laws, policies nationally to integrate people, different ways of thinking, and priorities beyond just, the constant use, and overuse, and who knows, the pollution effects and all that from just that. I mean, besides the forest fires that are going on, um, how do we think about doing things better for both people and the land? So it's almost like this more modern notion of ESG, right? The three-pronged approach to business. Like, what is the environmental impact? What is the social impact? And what is the government's model that's being used to create industries and business and profits? Um, and so, even though Canada is going through a difficult, clearly difficult moment right now, and there's some difficult historical deeds that have been done. And again, no nation is exempt from that, right? I live in the United States, and clearly we do not have a pristine history here, by far, in terms of treatment of people and different cultures and the land, nature. But I think Canada, especially because the ascendant nakshatra is Revati, that's a very generous, hospitable nakshatra. And the chart is ruled by Jupiter, which is like optimistic and gracious planet. And again, most Canadians that I meet are very gracious by nature. I mean, they're well received all around the world. They're great travelers, and people I think tend to love Canadians more than Americans. Um, and which is I think understandable on some levels. But the thing is, it's like the opportunity that Canada has in this moment, this critical moment, is that they're the second largest land country of the world, second behind Russia, and they're the ninth largest economy. Because they're so heavily reliant on natural resources for their economy, but because of their current level of consciousness, wanting to do social good and environmental good, I think Canada has the opportunity to become a world leader, and how are we going to move forward? I'm going to start to cry. Got really emotional about this. How are we going to move forward, into the future with the way that we currently use the land, the way that we currently exploit people to make a profit? How can we be profitable but still do good on those other, facets of life, culture? And so I'm hoping that Canada rises to that challenge. I'm sorry, hold on. So yeah, so I think that's the opportunity that Canada has in this difficult moment. Is again not just to focus on the surface issues, but to dig deeper into how do we do all of this better moving forward and keep it more in balance. And by doing so, again, tying this in from the Vedic astrology perspective, is that by moving forward and creating good karma moving forward, is that that's really how Canada's going to create better outcomes for itself and the rest of the world. Again, not just, dousing the fires, which again clearly needs to happen, but I think if they dig deeper into their policies and laws around how they're doing business, that's really what's going to rescue Canada and again the rest of the world. So, well, I wish you well, Canada. Lead us into a bright future, hopefully. Just a few more aspects. Most of them we've already covered. This is just kind of looking at it from just mentioning it from the other side, the other planet that's involved, because these are mostly aspects here. But July 10th, as I mentioned, that Rahu's going to do an exact aspect to Mars and Leo. See previous slides about that. On July 16th, Sun is entering Cancer, Karka, Punarvasu. It's going to be in Punarvasu nakshatra. It's a friendly sign for Sun, but it's a movable water sign. So this is again where the sun's going to bring energy to emotions. And part of the drive, mission, purpose at that time is actually diving into emotions. Like, how do we really feel about things? So this might literally be something like, how do we go out and return to our purpose and mission and work? July 20th, I mentioned already, Saturn has an exact aspect with Mars. See previous slides. On July 22nd, there's going to be almost an exact aspect of Rahu on Venus, which is going to go retrograde and be in um, planetary war with Mercury. So there's going to be a little bit of shifting going on then, and this is all happening in Leo. So most of this is going on in Leo. And again, Leo is in the natural zodiac. And the natural zodiac is when we line up the first constellation of the zodiac with the first house. So that would be Aries in the first house, which is sort of like if we were going to do a horoscope for the world, it would be the natural horoscope. Leo is in the natural zodiac as a fifth house, which represents things like children, creativity, counseling, and acting. So again, there's this kind of, what's coming to mind, if we're talking globally here is like on the global stage, how are we, going to bring practical solutions for generations to come, our children, right? Our collective children, yeah. And then Venus is going to go combust, asta, I mentioned that. So see the previous slides, and it's going to retrograde into Cancer. So, feelings, home, that sort of thing, that's what Cancer represents. And Venus is going to be in Cancer till October 1st. So Venus is going to do a deep dive into feelings and notions of home. And it's going to be in Aslesha nakshatra most of that time. So an Aslesha, it's represented by the snake, is represented by a snake. And because Venus is a benefic planet, the more positive aspects of Aslesha are going to come through. So you might actually see things like benefit concerts being created, produced, created, organized for like the forest fires, for example, specifically, or um, it could be, again, how do we create practical solutions? How do we really heal deeply social um, social connections and that sort of thing, so that we're working together as opposed to opposing each other, that sort of thing. All right. So again, usually at the end of my transit videos and stuff like that, I put these slides up. I don't go through each individual constellation and what these planets represent because there's too much there and there's too much individual variation, especially when you deeply consider dasha, planetary periods people can be going through and what planets are chidra grahas and all this and all the amshas, the subzodiacs. I think it's really too much. And it's not going to serve people really. But if you do have a copy of your own Vedic astrology chart, which you can get online for free in many places, I think a lot of the story this month is going to be about Leo somehow. So if you get a copy of your chart and you figure out which house Leo is in, um, I think the energies this month are all about leadership. And, if we're talking about a collective energy, it's not just about, how governments and administrators step up or not, because those were the charts I went through, like with the Titanic in Canada, or how they can or should or anything like that. But, again, that's all kind of the blame and shame game, I think. It's all an opportunity, really, depending on what direction people want to go and take their, constituents. But um, it's really a call for all of us on whatever level. I mean, even if we don't have a grand following or we're not in charge of a large organization or a nation, the energies presented to us this month are all about stepping up in leadership in some way, whatever small way. Like maybe your thing is, rescue animals, or maybe children, or maybe senior citizens, or whatever it is. But the more that we each step up in our own lives, that's what I'm gathering from this, is that's how we're going to create these bridges potentially, instead of moving the other way. So my suggestion is that if you do have a copy of your chart, to find out where Leo Simha is in your chart, and then see. So if it's like the second house here, I have the second house is related to family, speech, wealth, food, and drink. So probably that's an indication of where this energy is going to be playing out. A lot of this energy is going to be playing out in your life. Or if it's in the seventh house here, I have your spouse, partnership, independent business. So maybe that's where all this, Sun and Saturn, Mars, all these planets are going to be moving through Leo this month. Those areas of life are where you're going to be seeing this energy play out in your own life. So I have 6 of the 12 houses here, and then on the next slide I have the other 6. Yeah. So there you have the other 6. So as always, thank you for your time. I appreciate your attention and your interest in Vedic astrology, and hopefully some of these larger energies that are showing up in different ways for different nations and events that we're all kind of watching in the world. But again, hopefully also too that this sort of analysis and going through these charts and stuff like that is a reminder of greater forces at work in our lives, and to really take the higher road when you can, because that's ultimately how you're gonna create the best personal outcomes in your life, but also for the rest of the world. So a challenge for all of us, yeah. Um, I do offer, as I mentioned, all my teaching videos on Vedic astrology are in my concepts playlist. So if you're interested in learning more about Vedic astrology and how to navigate charts, it's creating, collecting videos there. I do individual birth chart readings on Zoom. So if that's of interest, you can email heartlightastro@yahoo.com. I do have another YouTube channel on natural medicine where I talk about other Vedic arts such as Ayurveda and yoga. Ayurveda is traditional Indian medicine, as well as other natural medicines such as homeopathy and naturopathic medicine. And that channel is called Nature Source Care. So again, I create all this in service to you. So again, I wish you well. Take care of yourselves, and until next one, namaste.